recalibrate, basically, which is an ongoing process. And the further you go with this, rather than these huge swings from being high and cool and balanced to being low and detached and fragmented, that smooths out and it becomes more a game of fine-tuning rather than radical kind of remodeling.
I noticed in a lot of your work you were talking about the Gnostic scriptures about the archons and how they relate to some ETs. And actually, I'd love to talk about how they some of the pitfalls of when people are opening up, because I always tell people before you even meditate or do anything, it's so important to clear your space and maintain your self-authority. And I see so many people just jump into anything that comes, and these beings jump in and they flatter you and they give you powers and abilities and all these other things. But there's always a price, which is your own spirit connection or your own soul connection. So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about that.
Sure, yeah. Well, Gnosticism is a fascinating subject in itself, and there are various writings and various tractates, as they call them, not least the Nag Hammadi library, which was this set of texts which were found in Egypt and so on in the 1940s. And there are other texts as well and other kind of writings that we can get hold of. And it's a very loose term, really. And as I said at a conference earlier this year, the Gnostics, really, to call someone a Gnostic derives, I understand, from a Roman slang term, which was to call someone a know-it-all. So there was an element of that in that the Gnostics didn't necessarily call themselves the Gnostics. And as the Gnostic scholar John Lash suggests, they called themselves the Telestai. So when we talk of Gnosticism, we're just using common terminology so we can all kind of get a handle on what's going on here. But there are other layers to that, but anyone who's interested will encounter that soon enough. But the Gnostics were really a sort of pre-Christian spiritual group who they're way ahead of any Christian stuff. And the Christian theologists would have it that they were kind of like an unusual offshoot or slightly pre-Christian group, and Christianity took some of their stuff and moved forward with it and stuff. And in my studies of the 3 or 4 classic texts, that is definitely not the case. The Gnostics were around for an awfully long time. And in fact, as Telestai, the group, they probably derive from even earlier traditions of Druidic traditions and really indigenous shamanic traditions that, depending on where you were, as religious hierarchy kind of dominated and colonialized those spaces, it became Zoroastrianism or Mithraism, Romanism, Catholicism, and so on. And so it's always very difficult if you're using purely historical texts or Wikipedia texts. You have to really kind of do your own esoteric research as well and balance the two, not jump to one or the other, but balance the two. But the key principle of Gnosticism was that the Gnostics, unlike the Christians, put forth the idea that the reality that we experience, this world we all live in here on Earth, was formed by an entity called the demiurge. And the demiurge was a godlike being, not the god, in inverted commas, but a godlike being. And his job, really, I say his, obviously he didn't necessarily have a penis, so it's a bit strange to put gender in it like that, but we'll say that for now. This being, the demiurge, his job really was to look after the formulation of the earth and keep the quantum probability of a tree being a tree and of a man being a man and an apple being an apple all in place. And like all things, this entity was a thought form of the infinite divine creator. And again, for those who would prefer non-spiritual or divine language, you could say something different, like he was a fractal template or a quantum algorithm or something. But there was definitely this yes, precisely, yeah. But whichever, we're talking about the same thing. The demiurge emanation was given the primary task of manifesting what I would term the default reality construct, consensus reality, through which all of us initially arise as units of consciousness, and we get to this place in order to self-actualize, spiritualize, explore, articulate, create, transcend. So it is a very, very significant place to come. And finally, that we transcend the polarity of this 3D existence, this temporality, and return to source. Not that's it over with, but probably for the next part of the journey, and so on and so on. So to put it plainly, we go down into the world, we cultivate our spiritual awareness, we map the immediate creation, and then we go home. Mm-hmm. Now, despite its root neutrality, like all thought forms, the demiurge is subject to compromise, is subject to error. And certainly in the Nag Hammadi texts, in these series of kind of parchment tractates, these little things that range from 1 page to sort of 25 and 30 pages, all collected together, many of them agree on the fact that there was an error in the system. And some researchers suggest that this error was kind of like due to the formation of really an ego within the demiurge, within this secondary god. And when the demiurge developed an ego, a personification of himself, then he started to acquire many of the challenges and polarizations that anybody with an ego is subject to. So the whole superstructure of reality has an error in it. It's like a program. It's like the Matrix. It has a bug in it. And deep Gnostic study begins to reveal that that is actually part of the plan, that this place is kind of fundamentally flawed on purpose. So we're not criticizing the divine creator because presumably he's not going to make those kind of mistakes. Mm-hmm. He puts it in place for a reason. And what we end up with is a world that was conceived of by an entity that saw itself as separate, and it saw itself as the ultimate, basically. So here we are in this world, in an imperfect, flawed creation by what some Gnostics called an insane god, a blind god. And they used the word Samael, which is the blind, basically. So the demiurge is in error, and therefore what it creates, despite the splendor and all the beauty, is also prone to error. And that error is indicated through polarization. And that's why we get these huge yuga cycles, these cyclical manifestations of darkness and of goldenness and of bliss. And it could be argued that we are currently exiting one of the sort of seasonal shadow realms where spirit and flesh is kind of trying to survive, basically. And life is, as Buddha said, is a struggle. And that's what Buddha meant, I would say, when he observed without any judgment or without any personalization that life is suffering. He didn't mean it's rubbish or it's pain. He meant it is necessarily a struggle. And in observing this struggle, not only in our own lives, but on a higher philosophical and spiritual level, we begin to see a deeper context. And the deeper context is that the construct is synthetic, is fabricated. So the world that we exist in, the world that we see here, as we cultivate our spiritual awareness, as no doubt, as soon as you get into the sort of permanent 4 and 5D realms, you become aware that the Earth construct is synthetic, and it uses real, as we might say, organic structures, but they're organized in a synthetic way. And this, of course, is what leads to conspiracy research and Illuminist groups and so on, who are also aware of this and use this to their advantage. And higher beings who have nevertheless chosen external technology rather than internal spiritual technology are also caught up in that paradigm. So we're not just dealing with men, we're dealing with things outside of that as well. I'm sure you have your thoughts on that. So that is why, as you quite rightly say, acknowledging source, as many abductees have attested to, and acknowledging the divinity within us is kind of like a pretty bulletproof way of protecting yourself from any external influence or manipulation, because nothing can touch that, basically. Nothing can touch that. And although you might be wiped out or you might go totally unharmed, nevertheless it remains that your divinity is intact, because that ultimately is what lower beings run from. And they're always on the run from it because they spring from, in the Gnostic paradigm, the demiurge, which is in error.
Mm-hmm. I've noticed that we've had a lot of encounters here with I always tell people not all ETs are friendly. There's some that are very, very self-serving. And so it's really good to know who's who in the universe and get that inner sensitivity going and that self-authority. And as you're saying, make your own connection with source or spirit and run it through that. And I just see so many people running amok and, getting cities. They get these abilities and these powers, but they don't realize where they're coming from, and they haven't used that discernment. And I see so many people flock to these people because they can demonstrate these cities and these powers, but, I feel, well, that's their lesson as well. They will go to that person for whatever experience they need. But at the same time, it's so important. I always tell people that we have that as one of the first premises, that learn how to heal unseen negative influences and maintain your own self-authority before you go jumping into other worlds and the other dimensions, because it's not always friendly out there.
That's right, and that's precisely the reason why kind of symbolic and ritual occultic practice you would draw a circle which would represent your sovereignty and your, divine connection and your protection, to say, I symbolize my sovereignty in this circle and nothing can penetrate that. You don't need to draw the circle if you understand the underlying mechanics of that, which is that you are sovereign. And in that sovereignty is your lineage, your divine lineage to the source. And again, that may be spiritual or scientific depending on your view, but it's probably neither. It's just something much more organic than that. What I would say is that, and a very interesting little perspective on this, there is an assumption that if somebody is massively technologically superior to you, that they have done the inner work. They are hugely initiated and adept at the inner work. Not so, not so. If, as we said earlier in this conversation, that we recognize that many units of consciousness, many people, many beings, many entities, if they find the inner work difficult, they will do everything at their disposal to delay it and defer it and hide it and squash it. And this goes for every being as well that isn't necessarily derived from Earth in contemporary times. So anybody who isn't doing the inner work is compelled to take part in negatively polarized activities that will suppress their own inner work. So if you come across a negative entity, to some extent, it is not doing its inner work. So the greatest power we have is to, in acknowledging source, is to understand that the work we do in ourselves, the spiritual, the emotional, the philosophical, using intuition, using reason, using more, subtle energies than that, the whole game, the whole jigsaw, the whole spectrum. As we do that, we begin to become more resilient to those kind of energies. So that's why it is so